There's a whole bunch of knobs and screws and dials and all kinds of things on these shocks. So what does all this stuff do?
I don't know. I was hoping you knew.
I'm heading down to the San Francisco Bay Area to spend the afternoon with motorcycle suspension guru Ted Porter at his shop in Scotts Valley, California. Ted has more adventure motorcycle suspension tuning experience than probably just about anybody. Let's pick his brain about suspension setup and adjustability. All right, Ted, so here's what I want to know. Suspension has a job to do. What's the job of suspension?
The primary goal of the suspension is to keep the tires in contact with the ground. I mean, that's it.
What is it that's most important for adventure riders to know about suspension?
Well, I guess for starters, how to set it up properly. Oftentimes we go to these adventure bike events and everybody's rolling in to the place with the front end in the air and the rear over-sagged.
So SAG is simply the measurement of how much the suspension compresses and how much distance is used based on the load that's on top of the spring. Why is it not okay that the back of the bike is sitting low?
Yeah, for a variety of reasons. Number one, it affects the trail up front. So this is one of your measurements of steering geometry. And when the back goes down, the front tends to lift and the trail goes long. And what happens then is the bike wants to go straight. It just doesn't want to turn. So it's very important to make sure that the sag in the back is correct for your steering geometry, for starters. But then the other issue, of course, is if you have too much sag, now you're really close to the bumper and you're riding down the road. You don't have enough travel to absorb the impacts. The other issue, though, is negative travel, which is something people don't think about. The suspension's primary job is to keep the tire in contact with the ground, right? So if you're encountering a dip at speed, off-road particularly, and you've got a depression in the terrain, you want that tire to be able to drop down into the terrain and leave the bike behind, essentially. It needs to follow the dip. If you run out of travel, then what happens is you're going to lose traction. The tire's just going to lose contact with the ground.
There's two types of sag we're interested in.
The amount that the suspension sags when you sit on it, when you're ready to ride, when you're loaded, whether passenger or not, luggage or not, that's your rider sag. That should always be about 30% of your travel for an adventure bike. Then you have static sag, which is when you just push the motorcycle off the center stand and it sags of its own weight. Just the motorcycle holding up its own weight. That's your static sag.
Once you have the right spring, then you can achieve proper sag using the preload adjustment on the shock.
If your spring rate is correct for your motorcycle, after you set your rider sag to 30% of your travel, when you get off the bike and you measure your static sag, which is just the weight of the bike sitting on its own tires, that will be roughly 10% of your travel.
In order to set sag properly, you have to start with the right spring.
When you put the load on the motorcycle and you set your sag to 30% and you are adding preload, if the spring is too weak, when you get off the bike, what's all that preload going to do? It's going to push the bike up in the air, and your static numbers get really small. So if you've got perfect rider sag, and you go, well, hey, I don't need a spring, my rider sag is fine, and then you get off the motorcycle and you only got 5 millimeters of static sag, that tells you that it needed so much preload to get your sag correct that your spring's just too soft.
I meet a lot of off-road riders that are really focused on how much ground clearance they can get with their suspension.
Whenever we want to lift the bike up more, you have to be careful if you start cranking in preload and to get more ground clearance. Then it might be an argument for increasing suspension travel. In other words, installing taller suspension. Like if you have a GS, you put a GS Adventure suspension on. That's something that you can do. Because then you're maintaining that 30% of your travel, but you're lifting the whole bike up in the air. Remember that we're trying to use one spring rate to cover sometimes a very wide load. So let's say when you're solo, I've had customers like this, 175 pounds solo, but 450 pounds two up. In a perfect world, you would actually, no one's going to do this, but sometimes people do this, you would actually have a different spring for that load. Because the spring that's correct for that 175 pound person is not correct for the 450 pound load. But we don't want to be changing springs for every load, that's ridiculous. So we have a certain amount of load range we can cover in the hydraulic preloader. And so then it goes to how much stroke does the hydraulic preloader have, because they're not all created equal. Some only have 6, some have 10, some have 15. But ideally, when we're looking at those kinds of loads, we ask, what's the percentage of the time that you're going to be at 450 pounds? Because if it's a high percentage, then we're going to move the spring rate up. We're not going to just rely on the preloader. And then it might be a little bit firm for that person when they're solo. It's going to be really dependent on the customer, what their loads are, what the delta is between the minimum and maximum, that sort of thing.
Because with adventure bikes, they're always kind of in the middle. You know, we want them to work well in the street, we want to work well off-road, and in the reality, we always end up land in the middle. And so now you're dealing with a motorcycle that's designed to live in the middle, and riders who often commute and then they travel on them. And now you're talking one shock, it's supposed to do everything. How do you work around that challenge? What do you do?
That is part of the whole interview process.
Adventure motorcycle suspension isn't something you just order up off of Amazon or eBay. It's something that needs to be tuned specifically for your bike and your riding needs. It's something where talking to a professional to make sure you get the right springs and right damping settings really makes the difference and make sure that you get the best performance out of your motorcycle.
What's your minimum routine everyday load, including your luggage? I had a customer that had 81, we measured it or weighed it, it was 81 pounds of stuff that stayed on the bike 100% of the time. Okay, so that's
a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff. So we had to consider that in to his total payload. Also, riding gear is very commonly 20, 25 pounds. That's why we always ask, make sure that grab your stuff. You don't have to put it on, but grab it, go stand on the bathroom scale. And then also where the load is located is critical. Jeff and I were doing some measuring with load located here on the seat and how that affected SAG, and load located all the way back here to see how that affected SAG. And it was something like 1.5 times the difference. So where your load is located is also huge. You want to keep that load as far forward and in the bags and not off and keep it off the rear rack as much as possible.
Because that's not just going to have an effect on the balance of the bike, but it's also going to have a pretty significant effect on suspension, which
for sure.
A lot of us don't think about.
If you think about it, if you were to stand next to your motorcycle and try and bottom the suspension by pushing on the seat, you'd have a difficult time. You might be able to do it, depending, but you're going to have a difficult time. If you go all the way back to the luggage rack and you try and bottom your suspension, no problem, easily. So you can really see the leverage advantage that the further rearward you get, that advantage has over the shock. That's why you want to keep, as much as possible, keep that big load off the tail.
The street bikes don't move very much. But the adventure bikes, they move a lot because they have so much suspension travel. I know you've got to have people that come in and go, this bike doesn't feel right, it has too much dive, it's too soft. How do you know if your adventure bike is set up correctly? What should it feel like?
Well, feel, I mean, that's a wide open question. And also, here's the other problem with that question is that people want such a different feel. I could set this bike up so that you would love it, and the next guy comes along who's the same size as you, and he would say it's too soft or it's too firm. So to some degree, it's appeasing the customer's concept of what his bike is supposed to feel like. Now that's the advantage of having a fully adjustable shock, is that you can get there. The ideal situation is that the motorcycle is stable and it's not moving around and the tires are staying in contact with the ground. I mean, that's what you want. If you have a situation where you go into a turn and the back end is bouncing around and you don't feel like you have good control, then you may have insufficient rebound damping. If you go into a turn and it feels like the front end just wants to push through the turn, your trail might be long. You may have excessive sag. So bottom line is you want the motorcycle to feel correct. That's the closest thing I could come up with. Yeah, the bike should obviously, if you pick a line through a turn, it should stay on that line. If you had a bunch of bumps in that turn and the back end of the bike kicks out, then that's not correct. If you have a tremendous amount of chassis movement, when you're nailing the brakes and so forth, that's not correct. You have the ability to adjust that if you have a fully adjustable shock. Also, these bikes are delivered with very light spring rates. And like crazy light. True with the telelever models, particularly in the rear. Also true with the telescopic fork models, like an F800 GS or 700 GS or what have you. Fork springs are very light, so yeah, lots of nosedive, lots of weight transfer. In that case, yes, a set of springs. But once you get adjustment, once you get your spring rate set properly, then yes, you can achieve that. You can achieve being able to adjust out anything that doesn't belong there. I've had customers who really weren't all that interested in what all these adjustments did until they bought one adjustable shock, and then they totally got into it. And that's a beautiful thing. And now you have control over it. You can do whatever you need to do.
I love having as much adjustability over my suspension as possible. I like having high speed and low speed compression and ride height and preloads and all of these different adjustments. But for somebody just getting into suspension, all these knobs and dials can be really confusing.
You have one adjuster for your spring, and it has nothing to do with the shock whatsoever. And then you have adjusters for your shock that have absolutely nothing to do with the spring. If there was no room for this knob to attach to the shock, let's say it's this older 1150, for example, there's no room there because it's up inside of a tunnel. So the preload adjuster for the spring would be remote located. So the knob would be out here on the end of a hose. That's not a remote reservoir, that's a remote preload adjuster. And then when we talk about reservoir shocks, again, we have adjusters on the shock absorber that have nothing to do with the spring whatsoever. Basic shocks will have rebound adjust only. That tends to be on the very bottom of a shock, and that controls the return, the rebound of the shock, and how slowly or how quickly it rebounds. And then you have, on more advanced shocks where you have reservoirs, you now have some separate adjustability for the compression side.
There's no formula to set up the compression and rebound to be just perfect for you. That's something you have to do. You have to take the bike out and ride it and make those minor adjustments until it feels just perfect for you. And when it's right, the bike will feel like it just floats underneath you. And then there's ESA. It's a whole lot easier to work with, but there are fewer tuning options.
The adjustments are not very granular. So you have these, your comfort, normal, and sports setting, which is 3 settings. I mean, imagine if I sold you a high-end shock that only had 3 damping settings, right? That probably wouldn't sell many of those. And they're very far apart. So for example, let's say you had a 22-click scale, manually adjustable shock. Comfort, normal, and sport are very similar to like click 4, click 10, and click 18.
I don't have ESA on my bike because I want to have that fine-tuning adjustment where I can adjust the front separate from the rear and adjust each little element to be just right. What's the difference between electronic suspension and dynamic suspension?
Well, so for the original ESA, which came out in 05 with BMW, they were still manual shocks in the respect that there were no electronics inside. So essentially, it's like you have electric motors turning the knobs for you. But then in 2013, with the new liquid-cooled GS, BMW came out with the dynamic damping model, and it is actually an electronic shock. You now have a little proportion valve inside the shock that controls the amount of oil flow. You literally have all these inputs on the motorcycle coming from the ABS unit, looking at your braking, it's looking at lean angle, it's looking at acceleration, it's looking at suspension speed and where the suspension's located. All those inputs go into the controller, and then the controller sends a voltage to the shock. And the valve inside is sprung to be closed, and the voltage, it's just a magnetic field, and it pulls the valving open, and it allows the oil to flow through the valve. And that's changing like every 10 milliseconds based on all these inputs.
And I know some of you are thinking, I'm just going to push the button, and the button's going to say, I have a passenger or I have luggage. And if it's not perfect, I'm going to send you the shock and say, make it perfect. Is that going to work?
Well, certainly there are springs. Let's say you want to stay with the original suspension. Maybe it's brand new. You just have a load problem. We can replace the rear spring. That is no problem. We sell a lot of those, actually. And so you can live with the stock suspension for a while. Maybe you want to wait till you have 25, 30, 40,000 miles on the shocks. That's fine. Don't wait too long and go on a long trip, because I can tell you stories about that.
Because adventure riding goes everywhere from pavement to crazy off-road, there's no way to have suspension set one way and have it perfect in both environments. You've got to be able to make those adjustments as you move from one environment to the other. You've got to have adjustability in your suspension.
There are definitely 2 camps. There are people who appreciate that, and they want that. They want maximum tunability and adjustability. They want granular adjustability. Then there are other people who really don't want that. And so I try.
How can anybody not want more knobs and dials?
I know. There are customers who will tell me straight out, please don't take my ESA away from me. I love it. It's important to me. I don't care that there's only 3 settings for rebound damping. I commute during the week and I'm 1 load. On the weekends I'm 2 up and I'm another load, and all I have to do is push a button. So we can work with that. It's not as tunable. We talked about that earlier about the preload settings and how there are really only 2 settings, even though there's 5 icons. So on the oil-cooled bikes, you go from 0 to 50% to 100%. So sometimes you can't actually get your SAG set correctly with ESA because maybe 1 rider with luggage is not enough and 2 riders is too much. And so you can't hit that 30%. When you have a granular adjustment like this, you stop the knob where you want to stop the knob, and you can dial it in right to the millimeter. So pros and cons, there's definitely quality upgrades either way, whether you go ESA or non-ESA. But from someone who wants to be able to tune right to the money, then a manual shock's better.
And my load's constantly changing. I mean, sometimes I have a heavy load going out to a rally, or sometimes it's just a light load when I'm guiding tours or doing training. And sometimes it's just empty because I'm out playing. And so being able to have that perfect adjustment, that's the camp I'm in.
I hear you.
Thanks to Ted for making the time for Motor Trek. And Ted's going to be back here soon talking about how these shocks are built and all the different components that make them ideal for adventure motorcycling.